What makes a weapon too crude to be taken seriously? What separates legitimate military ingenuity from dangerous improvisation that threatens to undermine discipline and doctrine? And what happens when the line between the two becomes impossible to distinguish? In the chaotic theaters of World War II, where technological sophistication increasingly defined military superiority, a single soldier's decision to weaponize discarded farming equipment seemed absurd to the point of offense. Officers who prided themselves on modern warfare dismissed the contraption as primitive, dangerous to friendly forces, and symptomatic of the kind of unauthorized tinkering that eroded military order. They didn't just discourage its use, they explicitly banned it, ordering the device dismantled and threatening disciplinary action against anyone who attempted similar improvisations. The ban lasted exactly 4 days. That was how long it took for a German scout car, equipped with radios, maps, and intelligence that could have compromised an entire Allied position, to drive directly into the very trap that had been condemned as useless. The vehicle didn't just get damaged, it didn't merely become disabled. In the span of seconds, the improvised device transformed a sophisticated military asset worth thousands of dollars and countless hours of training into a twisted wreck of metal containing the bodies of 3 German soldiers who never had time to understand what killed them. This is the story of Corporal James "Jimmy" Patterson, a former Nebraska farmhand whose understanding of mechanical leverage and agricultural equipment translated into one of the war's most effective anti-vehicle traps. It is the story of how institutional prejudice against crude solutions nearly prevented a tactical innovation that would save dozens of Allied lives. And it is the story of how warfare sometimes rewards not the most sophisticated weapons, but the most practical solutions to immediate problems, regardless of how inelegant those solutions might appear to those who have never faced the problems they solve. The Italian campaign of 1943-1944 presented Allied forces with unique challenges that standard military doctrine had not adequately addressed. The mountainous terrain, narrow roads, and well-prepared German defensive positions created conditions where conventional tactics often failed, and improvisation became essential for survival. American and British forces found themselves fighting an enemy that had transformed Italy's natural geography into a fortress that consumed men and material at rates that shocked commanders accustomed to more mobile warfare. Corporal James Patterson arrived in Italy in October 1943 as part of the 36th Infantry Division, a Texas National Guard unit that had already seen combat in North Africa. Patterson was 24 years old, a product of the Nebraska farmland, where his family had worked the same soil for 3 generations. He had enlisted in 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, driven by a combination of patriotic duty and economic necessity that characterized much of rural America's response to the approaching war. What distinguished Patterson from many soldiers was not formal education or military ambition, but rather a practical intelligence shaped by years of agricultural work. He understood machines not through engineering textbooks, but through the necessity of keeping temperamental farm equipment functioning with limited resources. He knew how metal behaved under stress, how leverage could multiply force, and how simple mechanisms could be more reliable than complex ones when conditions were harsh and maintenance was impossible. The sector Patterson's unit occupied in November 1943 was a stretch of road that wound through hills northeast of Cassino. German forces controlled the high ground and used it to devastating effect, raining artillery and mortar fire on any Allied movement during daylight hours. At night, German scout cars and motorcycle patrols probed Allied positions, gathering intelligence and occasionally infiltrating to strike at supply lines and communication posts. These scout cars represented a particularly vexing problem. They were fast, well-armed, and equipped with radios that allowed them to report Allied positions immediately. Traditional anti-tank mines were in short supply and often ineffective against the lighter scout vehicles, which were sometimes able to trigger mines without sustaining disabling damage. Machine gun positions could engage the vehicles, but often failed to stop them before they completed their reconnaissance and escaped back to German lines. The narrow mountain roads created choke points that seemed ideal for ambushes, but German drivers had learned to be cautious, using infantry scouts on foot to check for obvious traps before vehicles proceeded. They varied their routes and timing, making it difficult for Allied forces to predict when and where to position defensive assets. The result was a frustrating situation where German reconnaissance operated with relative impunity, gathering intelligence that made Allied operations increasingly costly and dangerous. Patterson observed these patterns with the eye of someone accustomed to solving practical problems with limited resources. He noted that while German scouts checked for conventional obstacles and mines, they focused primarily on the road surface itself and on obvious positions where ambushes might be staged. They were looking for what they had been trained to expect: military equipment deployed in military fashion according to military doctrine. The idea that would eventually become Patterson's banned trap began forming during a conversation with an Italian farmer whose land bordered the American position. The farmer, speaking through a combination of broken English and gestures, complained about damaged agricultural equipment that had been abandoned when fighting swept through the area. Among the debris was a collection of farming implements including plows, harrows, and several heavy metal shovels with long handles. Patterson examined one of these shovels, noting its weight, the length of its handle, and the way its blade was constructed. Agricultural shovels of this era were built to last, constructed from thick metal that could penetrate hard soil repeatedly without bending or breaking. The handle, nearly 6 feet long, provided leverage that allowed a farmer to move heavy loads of earth with each motion. As Patterson hefted the shovel, his mind began working through mechanical principles he had learned not in classrooms, but through years of physical labor. The concept was deceptively simple. Patterson envisioned using the shovel as a massive spring-loaded lever. The blade would be buried and anchored firmly in the ground on one side of the road. The handle would extend across the road at an angle, held under tension by a mechanism that would release when a vehicle's weight triggered a tripwire. When released, the shovel handle would snap upward with tremendous force, driven by the leverage of its length and the spring tension stored in the bent metal. What made the concept potentially devastating was where the handle would strike. Patterson calculated that if positioned correctly, the handle would impact the undercarriage of a passing scout car at precisely the point where the vehicle's fuel tank was located. Even if the impact didn't rupture the tank immediately, it would certainly damage the vehicle's suspension and undercarriage severely enough to disable it, and if the force was sufficient to puncture the fuel tank, the resulting fire would likely destroy the vehicle entirely. Patterson spent 3 days refining the design in his spare time, working with materials scavenged from the abandoned farm and from military supplies that were technically available for field expedience. He calculated angles and tested the spring tension of bent metal using mathematical principles he had learned through practical application rather than formal study. He tested the trigger mechanism repeatedly, ensuring it would be sensitive enough to activate when a vehicle passed, but not so sensitive that it would trigger prematurely or from random vibrations. When Patterson finally approached his platoon sergeant to propose installing the trap, he did so with detailed sketches and a working model built from smaller materials. The sergeant, a career soldier who had risen through the ranks during peacetime, listened with growing skepticism. His initial response was to question whether Patterson had authorization to requisition materials for this project. When Patterson explained he had used scavenged civilian equipment and excess military supplies, the sergeant's skepticism turned to concern. The sergeant took Patterson's proposal to the company commander, a captain who had graduated from West Point and who prided himself on running operations according to proper military procedure. The captain's response was immediate and unequivocal. The device was unauthorized, potentially dangerous to friendly forces, and represented exactly the kind of improvised tinkering that could lead to disaster. He ordered Patterson to dismantle any prototype he had constructed and banned any further work on the project. The captain's reasoning reflected institutional biases that were common throughout the military. Improvised weapons created by soldiers in the field could not be properly tested or evaluated for safety. They introduced variables into tactical situations that commanders could not account for in their planning. They suggested that standard military equipment and doctrine were inadequate, which implicitly criticized the institutional structures that had developed and approved that equipment and doctrine. And perhaps most fundamentally, they represented unauthorized initiative from below, the kind of individual creativity that military hierarchy was designed to channel and control rather than encourage. Other officers who learned of Patterson's banned trap echoed these concerns. A lieutenant pointed out that if the device malfunctioned, it could kill Allied soldiers or destroy Allied vehicles. A major noted that improvised weapons violated supply chain protocols and created maintenance nightmares. Several officers expressed concern that allowing soldiers to build their own weapons would undermine respect for properly engineered military equipment and encourage a culture of dangerous improvisation. Patterson's fellow soldiers responded with more varied reactions. Some shared the officer's skepticism, viewing the contraption as the fantasy of someone who had watched too many cartoons and didn't understand real warfare. Others were intrigued, but doubted the device would work as intended, suggesting that the physics involved were more complicated than Patterson understood. A few soldiers who had agricultural backgrounds themselves looked at Patterson's sketches and calculations and quietly acknowledged that the concept might actually be sound, though they kept their opinions largely to themselves, given the command's explicit prohibition. The ban created an atmosphere of frustration among soldiers who felt increasingly helpless against German reconnaissance operations. They watched scout cars probe their positions night after night, knowing that the intelligence being gathered would eventually be used to direct artillery strikes or plan attacks against their positions. Standard defensive measures had proven inadequate, yet they were prohibited from trying innovative alternatives. This frustration would prove crucial in determining what happened when the tactical situation deteriorated further. James Patterson's journey from Nebraska farmland to Italian hillsides reflected the typical path of millions of American men whose lives were disrupted and redirected by global conflict. Born in 1919 in a small farming community outside of Lincoln, Patterson grew up during the Depression years, when agricultural hardship shaped every aspect of rural American life. His family, like countless others, struggled to maintain their farm against economic forces that seemed determined to drive small farmers into bankruptcy. From his earliest memories, Patterson understood work as physical labor that demanded both strength and intelligence. Farming in the 1920s and 1930s required constant improvisation. Equipment broke down regularly, and replacement parts were expensive luxuries that struggling farmers could rarely afford. Patterson learned to repair machinery using whatever materials were available, to improvise solutions when proper tools were unavailable, and to understand mechanical principles through observation and experimentation rather than formal instruction. His education was typical of rural America: 8 years in a one-room schoolhouse, followed by sporadic attendance at the county high school when farm work permitted. He never graduated from high school, leaving school at 16 to work the farm full-time when his father's health deteriorated. Yet his practical education continued through the daily challenges of agricultural life. He learned to calculate angles and forces when constructing fences and buildings. He learned about leverage and mechanical advantage when moving heavy objects with limited equipment. He learned about materials and stress points when repairing broken machinery. The Depression years taught Patterson another crucial lesson: the importance of seeing value in things that others had discarded. Wealthy farmers might replace broken equipment with new machinery, but Patterson's family survived by salvaging, repairing, and repurposing materials that others threw away. A broken plow might be transformed into parts for a harrow. Scrap metal could be fashioned into new tools. Nothing was truly worthless if you understood how to use it. This mindset of resourcefulness extended beyond mere frugality. Patterson developed an almost intuitive understanding of how objects could be repurposed, how their inherent properties could be exploited for purposes their designers had never intended. A metal rod was not just a rod but a potential lever, axle, or structural support. A spring was not just a spring but stored energy waiting to be released. This way of seeing objects not for what they were, but for what they could become, would prove invaluable in military contexts, where official supplies were often inadequate or unavailable. When Patterson enlisted in 1941, he brought these habits of mind with him into military service. Basic training attempted to standardize soldiers, to create interchangeable units that could be deployed anywhere and perform according to established doctrine. Yet Patterson's practical intelligence and improvisational skills set him apart from soldiers whose pre-war experiences had been primarily urban or whose work had involved less physical problem-solving. His commanding officers during training had mixed reactions to Patterson's tendency to improvise solutions. Some appreciated his ability to repair equipment and solve logistical problems. Others viewed his improvisations as violations of proper procedure that threatened to undermine discipline. Patterson learned to navigate this tension, understanding when to improvise quietly and when to follow established procedures regardless of whether more efficient alternatives existed. The North African campaign, where Patterson first saw combat, reinforced both his practical skills and his understanding of when improvisation was valuable. The desert environment created constant challenges with equipment maintenance, water procurement, and protection against extreme temperatures. Soldiers who could improvise effective solutions to these challenges improved not just their own survival prospects, but those of everyone around them. Patterson earned a reputation as someone who could make broken things work and create useful tools from unpromising materials. Yet North Africa also demonstrated the limitations and dangers of improvisation. Patterson witnessed incidents where unauthorized modifications to equipment caused failures that cost lives. He saw soldiers injured by improvised weapons that functioned unpredictably. He learned that not all problems could be solved through creative tinkering, and that sometimes following established procedures, however inefficient they might seem, was essential for maintaining unit cohesion and preventing catastrophe. One incident in particular shaped Patterson's approach to field improvisation. A soldier in another unit had modified a grenade to create what he believed would be a more effective explosive device. The modification seemed sound in theory, but it created instabilities in the explosive charge that caused the grenade to detonate prematurely when the soldier attempted to throw it. The soldier lost his hand and died from blood loss before receiving medical attention. Patterson witnessed the aftermath and absorbed the lesson. Improvisation required not just creativity, but rigorous testing and careful attention to safety margins. By the time Patterson arrived in Italy, he had developed a nuanced understanding of when improvisation was appropriate and when it was dangerous. He had learned to evaluate his ideas critically, to test designs before deploying them in combat situations, and to document his work in ways that would allow others to understand and maintain his innovations. Yet he had also developed confidence in his own judgment and his ability to see solutions that formerly trained engineers might miss. The Italian campaign created conditions that demanded exactly the kind of practical problem-solving Patterson had mastered on Nebraska farms. The mountainous terrain, the weather, and the nature of German defensive tactics created challenges that standard American equipment and doctrine had not been designed to address. Soldiers discovered that weapons and tactics that worked effectively in North Africa or would later work in France were often inadequate in Italy's unique environment. Patterson's observation of German scout car operations reflected his characteristic approach to problem-solving. Careful study of patterns followed by identification of vulnerabilities that could be exploited with available resources. He noticed that German drivers, despite their training and experience, operated according to patterns shaped by their expectations of what threats they would encounter. They looked for mines on the road surface, for machine gun positions in obvious locations, for obstacles that blocked passage. They were prepared to respond to conventional military threats deployed in conventional military fashion. This created an opportunity for unconventional approaches that German soldiers would not anticipate, because such approaches violated established military practice. A properly trained military engineer would never design an anti-vehicle trap using an agricultural shovel, because proper military equipment existed for such purposes. Therefore, German scouts did not look for threats built from agricultural equipment, creating a blind spot that clever improvisation could exploit. The concept of using a shovel as a spring-loaded lever emerged from Patterson's intimate familiarity with how such tools functioned. He had spent countless hours using shovels for various agricultural tasks, had repaired broken shovels, had modified shovels for specific purposes. He understood intuitively how the metal would behave under stress, how much force the handle could withstand before breaking, how the blade could be anchored to create a stable pivot point. The mathematical calculations required to translate this intuitive understanding into a functional weapon were not complex by engineering standards, but they required practical knowledge that formal training often failed to convey. Patterson needed to calculate the arc the handle would travel when released from tension, the force it would deliver at the point of impact, and the timing required to ensure the handle struck the target vehicle at precisely the correct location. He worked through these calculations using methods he had developed for agricultural applications, treating the shovel handle as a lever with a fulcrum at the blade's anchor point. He estimated the force that could be stored by bending the metal handle and calculated how that force would translate into impact energy at the end of the handle's arc. His calculations were approximate rather than precise, but they were grounded in practical experience that gave them validity despite their informal methodology. The trigger mechanism presented additional challenges. Patterson needed a system that would activate reliably when a vehicle passed, but would not trigger from wind, random vibrations, or the passage of small animals. He also needed a mechanism that could be constructed from available materials and that would be simple enough to maintain under field conditions. Complex triggers might be more precise, but they would be more likely to fail in the harsh conditions of combat. Patterson's solution drew on his experience with farm gate latches and similar mechanical devices. He designed a simple hook and release system that would hold the bent shovel handle under tension until a tripwire pulled the hook free. The tripwire would be positioned across the road at a height and tension calculated to be disturbed by a vehicle's passage, but not by smaller disturbances. The system was crude by engineering standards, but reliable precisely because of its simplicity. When Patterson completed his initial prototype and tested it using a weighted sled to simulate a vehicle, the results exceeded his expectations. The shovel handle, released from its bent position, snapped upward with explosive force. The metal, which had been storing tremendous energy in its bent configuration, transformed that potential energy into kinetic energy as it whipped through its arc. The force at impact was sufficient to crack wooden planks he had used to simulate a vehicle's undercarriage, confirming that it could certainly rupture a thin metal fuel tank. The successful test vindicated Patterson's calculations and demonstrated that the concept was sound. Yet it also revealed potential dangers. The force generated by the releasing handle was sufficient to cause serious injury or death to anyone who happened to be in its path. This meant the trap had to be deployed with extreme care to ensure that friendly soldiers would not accidentally trigger it or be caught in its arc of operation. Patterson developed detailed safety protocols for deployment and maintenance, recognizing that even an effective weapon could become a liability if improperly handled. The ban on Patterson's shovel trap illuminates fundamental tensions within military organizations, between standardization and adaptation, between institutional authority and individual initiative, between engineering sophistication and practical effectiveness. These tensions exist in all hierarchical organizations, but become particularly acute in military contexts, where the stakes of failure are measured in lives lost and battles forfeited. Military standardization serves essential purposes that are often invisible to those who have not experienced the chaos of combat. When weapons and equipment are standardized, soldiers can be trained on them systematically. Replacement parts can be manufactured and distributed efficiently, and commanders can plan operations with confidence that equipment will perform as expected. Standardization allows for economies of scale in production, simplifies logistics, and ensures that any soldier can operate any piece of equipment within their specialty. Yet standardization also creates rigidity that can prevent adaptation to local conditions and unique challenges. Standard equipment is designed to function adequately across a wide range of situations, which often means it functions optimally in none of them. When local conditions deviate significantly from the average scenarios that drove equipment design, soldiers may find that standard equipment is inadequate for their immediate needs. This is when improvisation becomes not just useful, but essential. The officers who banned Patterson's trap were defending principles that had genuine value. Allowing soldiers to build their own weapons from scavenged materials could create serious problems. Improvised devices might malfunction in ways that killed friendly soldiers. They might violate rules of warfare regarding prohibited weapons. They might create liability issues if they caused unintended casualties. And perhaps most importantly, they might encourage a culture where soldiers stopped trusting standard equipment and spent valuable time on unauthorized projects rather than following established procedures. The concern about friendly casualties was particularly legitimate. History is full of examples of improvised weapons that proved more dangerous to their creators than to their intended targets. Homemade explosives that detonated prematurely, modified weapons that exploded during firing, and improvised traps that triggered at the wrong time had killed countless soldiers throughout military history. Officers had a responsibility to protect their men from such dangers, and prohibiting unauthorized weapons modifications was a reasonable way to discharge that responsibility. The question of whether improvised weapons violated the laws of warfare also merited consideration. International agreements prohibited certain types of weapons that caused unnecessary suffering or that could not distinguish between combatants and civilians. While Patterson's trap did not obviously violate these prohibitions, it raised questions about whether improvised weapons could be adequately evaluated for compliance with international law. If every soldier began creating their own weapons, how could commanders ensure that all such weapons were legal? Yet the ban also reflected institutional biases that were less defensible. The assumption that solutions must come from properly trained experts, rather than from common soldiers, embodied class prejudices that had long characterized military hierarchies. Officers were educated professionals who had studied warfare systematically. Enlisted men were expected to execute plans rather than create them. A corporal from rural Nebraska, who proposed a weapon system based on agricultural equipment, was transgressing social boundaries as much as military ones. The aesthetic prejudice against crude solutions also played a role. Patterson's trap looked primitive, cobbled together from farming equipment rather than precision engineered in a military factory. It lacked the clean lines and sophisticated appearance of proper military equipment. To officers trained to associate quality with sophistication, the trap's crudeness suggested unreliability, regardless of whether the device would actually function as designed. This aesthetic prejudice reflected deeper assumptions about the relationship between sophistication and effectiveness. Modern military culture increasingly privileged technological complexity, treating sophisticated weapon systems as inherently superior to simple ones. Yet the history of warfare demonstrates repeatedly that the most effective weapon is not necessarily the most sophisticated, but rather the one that is most appropriate for the immediate tactical situation. A crude device that functions reliably under field conditions is superior to a sophisticated device that requires controlled conditions to operate properly. The question of who possesses relevant expertise also divided opinions on Patterson's trap. By conventional measures, Patterson lacked expertise in weapons design. He had no engineering degree, no formal training in ballistics or mechanics, no credentials that would qualify him as an expert. Yet he possessed practical knowledge, gained through years of working with similar materials and mechanisms under conditions that demanded reliability and resourcefulness. Was this practical knowledge less valid than formal education, or did different types of problems require different types of expertise? Military organizations have historically struggled with this question. They need to maintain discipline and hierarchy, which requires recognizing certain forms of expertise while dismissing others. Yet warfare constantly presents novel problems that established experts are poorly equipped to solve, precisely because these problems fall outside the domains where formal expertise has developed. This creates situations where the most relevant expertise may reside in unexpected places, with soldiers whose life experiences have given them insights that formal training cannot replicate. The debate over Patterson's trap also reflected different philosophies about risk and innovation. Conservative approaches emphasized avoiding failure by sticking with proven methods. Progressive approaches emphasized achieving breakthrough improvements by accepting higher risks of failure. Neither philosophy was obviously correct in all situations. Some tactical situations demanded conservative approaches where reliability mattered more than potential improvements. Other situations demanded risk-taking where potential benefits justified the possibility of failure. The specific situation facing Patterson's unit might have justified a more progressive approach. German scout cars were operating with relative impunity, gathering intelligence that made Allied operations increasingly dangerous. Standard countermeasures had proven inadequate. The cost of continuing to allow German reconnaissance to operate freely was measured in Allied casualties and compromised operations. In this context, the potential benefits of an effective anti-vehicle trap might justify accepting risks associated with an improvised weapon. Yet commanders often lacked the local knowledge required to make nuanced judgments about when innovation was justified and when it was reckless. Senior officers typically operated at a distance from frontline conditions, receiving filtered reports that smoothed over the messy realities of combat. They might not fully appreciate how urgent the scout car problem had become, or how inadequate standard countermeasures were proving. Their conservative instinct to ban unauthorized innovations reflected incomplete understanding of the situation facing frontline soldiers. This information gap between frontline soldiers and rear echelon commanders has characterized warfare throughout history and has never been satisfactorily resolved. Modern technology improves communication, but does not eliminate the gap, because understanding combat conditions requires experiential knowledge that cannot be fully conveyed through reports and briefings. Soldiers who live daily with specific threats develop intuitions about those threats that commanders in rear areas cannot easily acquire. This creates tension between frontline soldiers who see the need for adaptation and commanders who worry about the risks of unauthorized innovation. The psychological dimension of the ban also deserves examination. For Patterson and soldiers who supported his innovation, the ban represented not just a tactical error, but a dismissal of their competence and judgment. It suggested that their practical intelligence was worthless compared to the theoretical knowledge of officers who had never faced the specific problems Patterson was trying to solve. This dismissal created resentment that undermined morale and trust in command judgment. For officers who imposed the ban, Patterson's innovation represented a threat to their authority and expertise. If a common corporal could design effective weapon systems without formal training, what justified the authority officers claimed, based partly on their superior education and training. The ban served not just to control a potentially dangerous improvisation, but to reassert hierarchical boundaries that Patterson's innovation had challenged. Acknowledging the trap's potential effectiveness would require acknowledging that valuable expertise existed outside formal channels, a recognition that threatened institutional power structures. Despite the official ban, Patterson did not entirely abandon his trap concept. He dismantled the prototype he had constructed near the road, complying with the letter of the order he had received. But he preserved the components, storing them in a location where they would be readily accessible if circumstances changed. And he continued to refine his calculations and design in his spare time, treating the project as a theoretical exercise rather than as an active weapon deployment. Patterson's decision to preserve rather than destroy his work reflected a calculated judgment about military culture. Direct defiance of orders would lead to severe disciplinary consequences that would end his ability to contribute to the unit's operations. But maintaining materials and knowledge that could be rapidly deployed if circumstances changed allowed him to remain ready to act should the tactical situation deteriorate or command attitudes shift. The tactical situation did indeed deteriorate over the following days. German scout cars continued their reconnaissance operations with increasing boldness, apparently confident that Allied forces lacked effective countermeasures. On the third night after Patterson's trap was banned, a German patrol penetrated close enough to Allied positions to observe defensive arrangements in detail. The intelligence they gathered was used the following morning to direct artillery fire that destroyed 2 Allied supply trucks and killed 4 soldiers. This incident created frustration throughout the unit. Soldiers could see German vehicles operating in areas where they should have been vulnerable, but where Allied forces lacked effective means to engage them. Machine gun positions were too easily avoided. Artillery was too slow and imprecise to target fast-moving vehicles. The few anti-tank mines available were in the wrong locations and could not be moved without explicit authorization from higher command. The sense of helplessness grew with each successful German reconnaissance mission. On the 4th day after the ban was issued, Patterson's platoon sergeant sought him out during a rare lull in activity. The sergeant had been thinking about the banned trap, reconsidering whether the captain's prohibition had been justified. The sergeant was a pragmatist who cared primarily about keeping his men alive and accomplishing assigned missions. He had watched German scout cars operate with impunity and had lost men to artillery strikes directed by intelligence those scout cars had gathered. His patience with conservative command decisions was exhausted. The conversation that followed was careful and indirect, reflecting the delicate position both men occupied. The sergeant could not explicitly order Patterson to violate a direct command from the company commander. Patterson could not openly suggest that he intended to defy orders. Yet both men understood that circumstances had created a situation where the banned trap might be quietly deployed without explicit authorization, allowing both of them to maintain plausible deniability if questions arose. The sergeant's position was essentially this: he would be conducting an inspection of defensive positions later that evening and would be occupied elsewhere for approximately 2 hours. What soldiers did during that time was their own responsibility, provided they did not bring official attention to unauthorized activities. If a trap appeared overnight at a location where German scout cars frequently operated, and if that trap was constructed from materials that appeared to be battlefield debris rather than military equipment, the sergeant might reasonably assume it was enemy equipment or random battlefield detritus rather than an unauthorized Allied weapon. Patterson understood the implicit message. He had approximately 2 hours to deploy his trap, and he had to do so in a way that would not obviously implicate either himself or the sergeant should questions arise. The trap had to appear potentially German, or at least ambiguous enough that its origins could not be definitively determined, and it had to work, because if it failed or caused friendly casualties, both Patterson and the sergeant would face severe consequences. Working with 2 other soldiers who had agricultural backgrounds and who understood what Patterson was attempting, he moved rapidly to deploy the trap. The location he selected was along a stretch of road that German scout cars had used repeatedly, a section where the terrain naturally channeled vehicle traffic into a predictable path. The area had sufficient cover that the men could work concealed from German observation posts on the surrounding hills. The construction process took about 90 minutes of intense work. Patterson and his helpers dug a deep hole on the uphill side of the road, anchoring the shovel blade firmly in packed earth and reinforced with rocks. They positioned the blade at an angle that would create the optimal leverage when the handle was bent and held under tension. The handle extended across the road, its end positioned where it would be compressed against the opposite bank when bent into its tensioned position. The trigger mechanism was the most delicate component. Patterson had refined the design based on his earlier prototype work, creating a hook system that would hold the bent handle under tremendous tension but would release cleanly when the tripwire was disturbed. The tripwire itself was positioned at precisely the height where a scout car's undercarriage would contact it, but where it would not be visible during the hasty reconnaissance that German drivers conducted before proceeding. The camouflage was crucial, both for tactical effectiveness and for maintaining plausible deniability. Patterson used natural materials to disguise the trap's components, making them blend with the surrounding terrain. The tripwire was positioned to look like a naturally occurring vine or root, rather than a deliberately placed obstacle. The bent shovel handle was partially concealed by brush that had been carefully arranged to appear natural. To casual observation, the area looked undisturbed, just another section of Italian countryside scarred by war. As the soldiers completed their work, they took pains to eliminate evidence of their presence. Boot prints were carefully obscured. Disturbed earth was arranged to look natural. Excess materials were removed and disposed of far from the trap location. When they finished, even someone looking directly at the trap location would have difficulty identifying it as anything other than random battlefield debris and natural terrain features. Patterson and his helpers returned to their positions well before the sergeant's inspection was scheduled to conclude. None of them spoke of what they had done, maintaining the silence necessary for plausible deniability. If questioned, they would claim to have been resting in a dugout during the sergeant's absence. The trap's existence would remain unofficial, known only to the 3 men who had built it and to the sergeant who had tacitly authorized its construction through strategic absence. The waiting began that night. German scout cars did not operate on predictable schedules, and there was no guarantee that one would use this particular route in the near future. Patterson knew that every night the trap remained in place, without triggering increased the risk that it would be discovered by Allied or German patrols. Yet he also knew that the route had been used frequently enough that the odds favored another German reconnaissance mission passing through within a few days. The wait lasted 36 hours. During that time, Patterson maintained his regular duties, while fighting the constant anxiety about whether the trap would work as designed, or whether it would be discovered, fail catastrophically, or cause some disaster he had not anticipated. He went over his calculations repeatedly in his mind, questioning assumptions and looking for errors. He imagined scenarios where the trap might fail or where it might cause unintended casualties. The responsibility for what he had created weighed heavily. Patterson found himself contemplating the moral dimensions of what he had done in ways he had not fully considered during the design and construction phases. He had created a weapon designed to kill, and if it functioned as intended, it would kill German soldiers who would have no warning and no opportunity to surrender. The trap was impersonal, mechanical, lacking the human judgment that normally accompanied the decision to take another person's life. Was this different from other weapons that killed impersonally? Or did the automated nature of the trap cross some moral boundary that should matter even in warfare? The German scout car approached Patterson's trap location at approximately 2:15 a.m. on a moonless night that provided ideal conditions for reconnaissance operations. The vehicle carried 3 men, a driver, a radio operator, and an officer responsible for observing and recording Allied positions. They had conducted dozens of similar missions and had developed justified confidence in their ability to probe Allied lines without significant risk. The driver followed his usual procedures, advancing slowly and scanning the road ahead for obvious obstacles. The vehicle's speed was modest, perhaps 15 miles per hour, fast enough to escape quickly if detected, but slow enough to maintain control on the rough road surface. As the scout car entered the section of road where Patterson's trap was deployed, none of its occupants perceived any threat. The vehicle's front wheel contacted the tripwire at 2:17 a.m. The impact was minimal, barely perceptible to the occupants, just another irregularity in a road surface pockmarked by shell damage and rough terrain. But that minimal contact was sufficient to pull the hook mechanism loose, releasing the tension that held the shovel handle bent across the road. What happened next occurred too quickly for human perception to process in real time. The shovel handle, released from its bent position, snapped upward with explosive force. The metal, which had been storing tremendous energy in its bent configuration, transformed that potential energy into kinetic energy as it whipped through its arc. The leverage of the 6-foot handle multiplied the force dramatically, creating impact energy far exceeding what the relatively modest bending force might suggest. The handle struck the scout car's undercarriage at precisely the location Patterson had calculated, directly beneath where the fuel tank was mounted. The impact was devastating. The force was sufficient not just to dent or crack the tank, but to rupture it completely, tearing a gash several inches long in the thin metal. Gasoline poured from the ruptured tank onto the vehicle's hot exhaust system. The resulting fire was immediate and catastrophic. Gasoline ignited explosively, engulfing the rear of the vehicle in flames within seconds. The driver attempted to accelerate away from the trap location, but the damage to the undercarriage had also impacted the vehicle's drivetrain. The scout car lurched forward perhaps 20 yards before the engine seized, and the vehicle rolled to a stop, now completely engulfed in flames. The 3 German soldiers had only seconds to escape the burning vehicle. The driver managed to throw himself from his seat, rolling clear of the flames, but sustaining serious burns in the process. The radio operator attempted to exit through the vehicle's rear door, but was overcome by flames before he could complete his escape. The officer, disoriented by the sudden violence, remained in the vehicle for several crucial seconds before attempting to exit. By then, the fire had consumed the interior, and he died either from burns or from smoke inhalation before reaching safety. Allied soldiers in nearby positions heard the explosion and saw the flames. Within minutes, a patrol reached the burning vehicle. They found the driver lying several yards from the wreck, badly burned but conscious. The bodies of the radio operator and officer remained in or near the vehicle, both clearly dead. The scout car itself was a total loss, its frame twisted by the heat and its contents reduced to ash and molten metal. Patterson was among the soldiers who responded to the scene. He approached the burning vehicle with complex emotions: satisfaction that his trap had functioned as designed, horror at the reality of what that function meant for the men in the vehicle, and anxiety about how command would respond when they inevitably investigated what had occurred. He had created a weapon that worked devastatingly well. Now he had to confront the human consequences of that success. The German driver survived long enough to be questioned briefly through an interpreter before dying from his burns several hours later. His testimony provided crucial intelligence about German reconnaissance procedures, but also revealed his confusion about what had disabled his vehicle. He reported that the vehicle had been struck by something from below, something that seemed to rise from the road itself. He did not understand what kind of weapon could produce such an effect, suggesting that the trap's unconventional nature had indeed created surprise that German training had not prepared soldiers to anticipate. The company commander arrived at the scene the following morning to investigate. His inspection of the area where the scout car had been disabled quickly revealed evidence of the trap. The bent shovel, now released from its tension, lay partly concealed by brush but identifiable by anyone who knew what to look for. The trigger mechanism, though partially destroyed by the vehicle's passage, remained sufficiently intact to reveal its purpose, and the anchor point where the shovel blade had been dug into the embankment showed clear evidence of deliberate placement. The commander's initial reaction was anger. He recognized immediately that someone had directly violated his explicit order banning such improvised weapons. He demanded to know who had constructed and deployed the trap, threatening court-martial proceedings for whoever was responsible. His fury reflected not just the disobedience itself, but the implicit challenge to his authority that such disobedience represented. If soldiers could simply ignore orders they disagreed with, what did that mean for military discipline and command authority? Yet even as the commander expressed his anger, he confronted the uncomfortable reality that the trap had worked exactly as its creator had promised. 3 German soldiers were dead, one of their most effective scout cars was destroyed, and intelligence recovered from the vehicle was providing valuable information about German dispositions and intentions. The trap had accomplished what standard military countermeasures had failed to achieve, and it had done so using materials that cost nothing and required no logistical support. The commander found himself in an impossible position. He could not explicitly authorize a weapon he had explicitly banned without undermining his own authority and acknowledging that his initial judgment had been wrong. Yet he could not ignore the tactical success the trap had achieved, or the reality that German reconnaissance had been a persistent problem that the banned trap had effectively addressed. He needed a way to resolve the situation that would maintain discipline while acknowledging the trap's effectiveness. The solution he arrived at reflected the kind of bureaucratic creativity that military organizations employ when official policy conflicts with tactical reality. The commander announced that investigation had revealed the trap was likely of German origin, an enemy device that had coincidentally affected a German vehicle. This fiction was transparent to everyone involved, but it provided a face-saving way to avoid pursuing disciplinary action while implicitly authorizing the continued use of similar devices. The commander then issued new guidance about captured enemy equipment that soldiers might encounter. He noted that such equipment, if properly documented and deployed in appropriate locations, could provide valuable defensive capabilities. He emphasized that any such equipment must be thoroughly inspected for safety and must be deployed in ways that minimized risk to friendly forces. This guidance was ostensibly about handling German equipment, but everyone understood it was actually authorizing Patterson's trap design while maintaining the fiction that such traps were of enemy origin. Patterson received no official recognition for creating the trap that had destroyed the German scout car. Indeed, he was never officially acknowledged as the trap's creator. Yet within the unit, his status changed dramatically. Soldiers who had mocked the trap as stupid now sought his advice on designing similar devices. Officers who had questioned his judgment now quietly consulted him about defensive innovations. The trap's success had validated Patterson's practical intelligence in ways that no amount of formal credentials could match. Over the following weeks, variations of Patterson's design appeared at multiple locations along the American defensive perimeter. Some used shovels, others employed different agricultural implements or modified military equipment. Each followed the same basic principle, using leverage and stored energy to create devastating impact against vehicle undercarriages. German reconnaissance operations in the sector declined dramatically as the risks of operating in areas where such traps might be present became too high to justify. The German response to these traps revealed how effectively they exploited gaps in standard military thinking. German engineers who examined captured traps struggled to understand their operating principles because the devices were so far removed from standard military engineering. Training manuals and reconnaissance procedures had not prepared German soldiers for threats built from agricultural equipment, according to principles that violated conventional weapons design. The psychological impact exceeded the trap's direct tactical effects. As German soldiers became increasingly paranoid about threats they did not understand and could not predict. The moral and legal questions raised by Patterson's trap generated debate that extended beyond his immediate unit. Some officers argued that the traps violated the laws of warfare because they could not distinguish between combatants and civilians. If Italian civilians driving carts or vehicles happened to trigger such traps, they would be killed or maimed despite having no military significance. This concern was not hypothetical, as Italian roads were used by both military and civilian traffic. Defenders of the traps argued that they were deployed in active combat zones along routes used primarily by military traffic, that civilians had been warned to avoid such areas, and that the devices were no less discriminate than landmines or other area denial weapons that were universally accepted as legitimate military equipment. They noted that the traps targeted vehicles rather than personnel, making them inherently more discriminate than many conventional weapons. The question of whether improvised weapons could be adequately evaluated for safety and legality remained unresolved. Each trap was unique, built by different soldiers using different materials and deployed in different locations. This made systematic safety testing impossible and created situations where individual soldiers were effectively making legal and ethical judgments that properly belonged to higher authorities. Yet the alternative, prohibiting all improvised weapons regardless of their potential effectiveness, seemed equally problematic when such weapons could save Allied lives and accomplish military objectives that standard equipment could not achieve. The broader implications of Patterson's trap extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. His success suggested that practical intelligence developed through non-military experience could sometimes prove more valuable than formal military training. It demonstrated that crude solutions could be more effective than sophisticated ones when local conditions favored simplicity over complexity, and it raised questions about how military organizations should balance the need for standardization and control against the need for adaptation and innovation. The incident also highlighted the role of organizational culture in either enabling or suppressing innovation. In a different unit with a different command climate, Patterson's trap might never have been deployed, despite its tactical value. The sergeant's willingness to create plausible deniability and the commander's eventual decision to resolve the situation through bureaucratic fiction were crucial in allowing the innovation to be tested and validated. This suggests that organizational culture and leadership attitudes matter as much as individual creativity in determining whether useful innovations emerge from frontline experience. James Patterson survived World War II and returned to Nebraska in 1945, resuming the agricultural life that the war had interrupted. He never spoke extensively about his military service, treating it as a temporary deviation from his real life rather than as a defining experience. The trap that had killed 3 German soldiers and validated his practical intelligence became a story he rarely told, filed away with other memories of a time when ordinary men had been required to do extraordinary things. The military's official records contain no mention of Patterson's trap or his role in its creation. The device was never formally documented, never incorporated into training manuals, never recognized as an innovation worthy of systematic study. It remained an improvised field expedient that existed in the gap between official policy and tactical reality, acknowledged through actions but never through words. This obscurity reflected not just the trap's unofficial origins, but a broader pattern of how military institutions treat innovations that challenge established hierarchies and procedures. Yet Patterson's trap had lasting effects that extended far beyond his own service. Soldiers who had seen or heard about the device carried knowledge of its principles to other units and other theaters. The concept of using agricultural equipment and mechanical leverage to create anti-vehicle traps spread informally through the kind of soldier-to-soldier communication that formal channels never capture. In various forms and configurations, similar devices appeared throughout the Italian campaign and occasionally in other theaters where conditions favored improvisation over standardization. The trap also influenced post-war thinking about improvised weapons and the role of field expedients in military operations. Military analysts studying the Italian campaign noted instances where improvised solutions had proven more effective than standard equipment, though they struggled to incorporate this observation into doctrine without undermining the principles of standardization that they believed essential for military effectiveness. The result was an uneasy acknowledgement that improvisation was sometimes necessary but should never be celebrated or systematized. The 3 German soldiers who died in Patterson's trap remained largely anonymous in historical records. They were young men serving their country in a war they may or may not have supported, killed by a weapon that military professionals on both sides would have considered crude and illegitimate. Their deaths accomplished a tactical objective from an Allied perspective, but they remained human beings whose lives were ended by mechanical violence that gave them no opportunity to surrender or retreat. This human dimension of Patterson's innovation cannot be ignored or rationalized away. The trap was designed to kill, and it killed effectively. The fact that it killed enemy soldiers engaged in military operations does not erase the reality of lives ended, families devastated, futures eliminated. The officer who died in the burning scout car might have been a dedicated Nazi or a reluctant conscript. The records do not say. But either way, he died in flames because a Nebraska farmhand had applied agricultural knowledge to military problems. The tension between innovation's benefits and its human costs characterizes Patterson's story and countless others like it. Military organizations need soldiers who can innovate and adapt, who can see solutions that formal training has not anticipated. Yet these same organizations must grapple with the ethical implications of encouraging creativity in the service of killing. Patterson's trap saved Allied lives by taking German ones, creating a moral calculus that resists simple judgment or clear conclusions. The question of whether Patterson's trap should have been banned remains genuinely debatable, even with the benefit of hindsight. The trap worked as designed and provided tactical advantages that standard equipment could not match. But it also created risks of friendly casualties, raised questions about legal compliance, and challenged command authority in ways that could have undermined discipline. Reasonable people can disagree about whether the benefits justified these costs and risks. What seems clear is that the ban reflected not just legitimate military concerns, but also institutional biases that prevented proper evaluation of Patterson's proposal. The assumption that solutions must come from formally trained experts, the prejudice against crude-appearing devices, and the reflexive conservatism that characterizes military bureaucracies all contributed to the initial rejection of a concept that proved tactically valuable. These biases remain embedded in military culture, continuing to shape how institutions respond to innovations from below. The story of Patterson's trap also illuminates the gap between official policy and operational reality that exists in all military organizations. Officially, the trap was banned and never deployed. In reality, it was quietly authorized through strategic ambiguity that allowed commanders to benefit from its effectiveness while maintaining the fiction that it did not exist. This gap between policy and practice creates space for necessary adaptation, but also generates cynicism about whether official procedures and regulations genuinely guide behavior or merely provide cover for actions that organizations wish to deny. Modern military organizations continue to struggle with the same tensions that Patterson's trap exposed. They need to encourage innovation while maintaining discipline, to allow adaptation while preserving standardization, to acknowledge practical intelligence while respecting formal expertise. They have developed increasingly sophisticated processes for evaluating and incorporating field innovations, but these processes still struggle to capture the kind of intuitive problem-solving that Patterson demonstrated. The rusted shovel that Patterson transformed into a deadly weapon has long since disintegrated, returned to the earth that provided the materials from which it was fashioned. The exact location where it killed 3 German soldiers is unmarked and probably unknowable. Just another piece of Italian countryside that has absorbed war's violence and healed itself with time and vegetation. The physical evidence of Patterson's innovation has vanished, leaving only stories and memories that grow fainter with each passing year. Yet the principles Patterson demonstrated remain relevant. The insight that practical intelligence developed through non-military experience can solve military problems, that formal training has not anticipated, continues to apply in contemporary conflicts. The recognition that crude solutions can be more effective than sophisticated ones when local conditions favor simplicity retains validity across changing technological landscapes, and the tension between institutional control and individual initiative remains unresolved in military organizations that must somehow balance these competing imperatives. Patterson's story invites reflection on how societies evaluate expertise and innovation. We tend to privilege formal credentials and sophisticated appearances, assuming that the most educated or technologically advanced solutions must be the best ones. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that different types of problems require different types of expertise, and that practical knowledge gained through experience can be as valuable as theoretical knowledge gained through formal study. The challenge is creating institutions that can recognize and leverage diverse forms of expertise without descending into chaos where everyone's opinion carries equal weight. The rusted shovel trap was banned as useless by officers who could not see beyond their institutional biases and aesthetic prejudices. It was deployed anyway by soldiers who understood that survival sometimes requires violating rules that protect institutional authority at the expense of tactical effectiveness. And it worked, killing 3 enemy soldiers in seconds and validating practical intelligence that formal military training had failed to recognize or cultivate. This success did not prove that all improvised weapons are effective or that all military regulations should be violated. It proved only that rigid adherence to institutional orthodoxy can prevent solutions to urgent problems, and that sometimes the most valuable knowledge resides in unexpected places, with people whose credentials do not reflect their capabilities. These lessons remain as relevant today as they were on that Italian hillside in 1943, continuing to challenge military organizations that must somehow balance innovation and tradition, discipline and creativity, institutional control, and individual initiative. The ghosts of 3 German soldiers remain in that Italian countryside, killed by a weapon their training had not prepared them to anticipate or defend against. The spirit of James Patterson remains there too, a farmhand turned soldier who refused to accept that his practical intelligence was irrelevant to military problems simply because it had been developed outside formal military channels. Their stories intersected for seconds of mechanical violence that validated unauthorized innovation and challenged assumptions about expertise, authority, and the nature of effective military solutions. In the end, Patterson's rusted shovel trap stands as testament to a simple but powerful truth. Sometimes the best solution to a problem is not the most sophisticated or officially sanctioned one, but rather the solution that actually works when it matters most. Military organizations that forget this truth do so at their peril, sacrificing tactical effectiveness on the altar of institutional orthodoxy and formal credentials. Those that remember it create space for the James Pattersons of the world to apply their practical intelligence to urgent problems, even when that intelligence comes wrapped in crude-appearing packages that offend aesthetic sensibilities and institutional prejudices. The trap was banned, it worked anyway, and that simple fact encapsulates enduring tensions about expertise, authority, and innovation that every military organization must navigate, but that none has fully resolved. Patterson's story reminds us that warfare's harsh realities sometimes demand solutions that violate peacetime assumptions about proper procedures and legitimate expertise. It challenges us to question whether our institutions are designed to recognize valuable knowledge regardless of its source, or whether they systematically privilege certain forms of expertise while dismissing others that might prove equally or more valuable in specific contexts. The rusted shovel that became a weapon, the farmhand who became an innovator, and the officers who learned too late that crude solutions can be devastatingly effective. These elements combine to tell a story that transcends its specific historical moment. It is a story about the eternal tension between doing things the right way, according to institutional standards, and doing things the effective way, according to practical necessity. Sometimes these approaches align, sometimes they conflict. Patterson's trap existed in that conflict, in the gap between what military doctrine said should work and what actual battlefield conditions demanded. And in that gap, a rusted shovel became more effective than sophisticated military equipment, a corporal proved wiser than captains, and practical intelligence triumphed over formal training. The lesson endures, challenging every generation to question whether its institutions are truly designed to recognize excellence wherever it appears, or whether they merely reinforce existing hierarchies while missing innovations that emerge from unexpected sources.